So, Andrew, what do you want to do this episode?
I don't know. How about we just FaceTime 2020 presidential candidate Joe Sestak?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Whoa, hold on. We can't just interview a presidential candidate looking like this.
You're right. We have to be professional.
I have to put my tie on, man.
I'm sorry. I should have thought about that.
They did not like Obamacare in a box with a fox, in a house, or with a mouse.
Pokemon go to the polls.
Have decided in 2020 to run for president.
And Corn Pop was a bad dude. And he ran a bunch of bad boys.
Get back in the business of creating a more peaceful world. Please clap.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nude News. We are joined today by our first ever guest of the show, Admiral Joe Sestak, who is currently running for president. How are you doing today, Admiral?
Good to be aboard, Andrew and Mark, and I'm doing pretty darn well. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. So, you started off your political career first representing my district in Congress, then you ran for Senate, and now you're running for president. Why should Americans vote for you?
Well, I wasn't going to get in this race a year and a half ago, but my daughter got brain cancer. Actually, it's her second occurrence. That's what drove me into politics originally, to pay back my country for the health care in the military that saved her life. And I wanted everybody to have the opportunity that I had had. This time, as she recovered from it, I got in because I think that probably the most important thing we have, our Hobson's choice, that is, there is no choice. And that is not just to beat Mr. Trump, but to heal our country's soul. We must have a president where people will trust them once again, and that they will trust the president because they will know that he is accountable to them, the people, above party, above oneself, above any special interest. Because if we don't unite this country, there's no way that we'll meet the defining challenge of our time. And that, guys, is why I got into this race. I represent nearly 2-1 Republican district, second Democrat since the Civil War. But I got reelected by nearly 20 points, and I didn't spend a penny on a campaign ad. Somehow we learned how to disagree well. And that's what Americans have to begin to do again.
Great. You mentioned there the importance that money has in politics a little bit. A lot of candidates in the race right now are electing to not take any super PAC money in their campaign. Do you subscribe to the same idea of not taking any corporate PAC money in your campaign?
Yeah, I've sent out to questionnaires that asked me that we wouldn't. But that said, I also made it clear that, legally, if a super PAC starts rolling money in against you, or for you, there's nothing you can do because you're not allowed to coordinate or even talk with a super PAC. And so you can put your best intention out there, but I just want everybody to know I'm not trying to fool anyone. If all of a sudden a PAC comes in against or for me, there is legally no way that you can mandate that they don't do something for you or against you. That said, money has harmed us greatly. And part of that is that we have this revolving door between those who are in government, and they can be political appointees, as well as the 450 congressmen or senators who then left Congress and went through the revolving door of becoming a lobbyist for some industry that had previously been lobbying them. And that's the same for those who are in the executive branch that makes the rules and regulations, then goes out and makes a lot of money by helping to work with industries to say, here's how you can get around them. It's quite harmful, I think, to the purpose of a government, which is to be of, for, and by the people, not corporations.
Of course.
So I'm going to circle back to one of your responses earlier. In depth in your announcement video for president, you discussed the role that the VA played in your daughter's treatments for cancer, and how that inspired your healthcare plan. So healthcare has been a very prominent issue throughout the Democratic debate and campaign cycle so far. What policy do you see most fit to achieve Democrats' vision for universal coverage in America?
Yes. Number one, fix the Affordable Care Act, which I went down to Congress to fight for because I had health care that was at least universal for my family and gave her exactly what my daughter needed. We got to fix that after this administration has pulled out some of the stool legs that are almost tottering today. Number two, have a public option. In fact, we need at least two public options for two tracks towards potentially single payer, where government pays directly to a hospital. I say two big public options because I voted for a public option when I was down there in the House of Representatives. But during the debate on the Affordable Care Act, the Senate did not stand up to the healthcare industry of insurance, and they took it out. What we need is one track that works towards Medicare for all as a goal, not as a certainty. I say that because there's 255 million Americans who are in some form of private health care. This is going to be a massive change. And anybody, like one candidate has said, we're going to do it to 2 to 4 years, doesn't understand what we learned in the military. Piss poor planning gives piss poor execution. We need to have a public option. That's a choice. People can choose to be in it. And then as it proves itself being better access, lower cost, and better care, more and more will come in. And once it proves itself, then you can move towards Medicare for all. And then we'll have a better idea of what the cost is. It ranges from 1.7 trillion to 4.4 trillion a year. Second, we got to think about the rural counties. Medicare for all is based upon a for-profit hospital. But in Iowa, where I've been, and in New Hampshire, they will have 20% of the rural hospitals, for-profit hospitals, close in the next few years because for-profit hospitals can't make money as people are leaving the rural counties. So how can Medicare for all meet the needs of a for-profit that is based on a for-profit helpful hospital? How's that going to help the rural people? And that's where the Trump supporters are. That's where the Clinton supporters also are. So I propose that one of those public options have a different track. Let's see if it can work towards a veterans hospital, a type of unit. That is, the government owns the hospital and the doctors.
So more of an
And
NHS
therefore,
style.
we can test that out and see if that will work in a rural county because they don't have to make a profit. And that might be what we need for it. So I want two tracks that work us towards universal pay. But you got to think, which my party's not doing, about how do you get a non-for-profit hospital where a for-profit hospital cannot any longer make a living, so to speak.
Of course, yeah. So going back to maybe your electability and your presidency, if elected president, you would be one of only two presidents from Pennsylvania, the other being James Buchanan. If elected, would you have any pride being from Pennsylvania and representing the country and being like the leader?
Do I have pride? You know I do. Look, we're really a purple state, and that's perfect for me because I want to represent all Americans. Second, this Keystone State has it all. The beauty of a beautiful of a country, but it has people that I think are the salt of the earth, and I don't say that lightly. You go into our rural counties, and you know, they're just, whether they've been coal miners, whether they've been farmers, or whether you go into the inner city, where in Philadelphia you actually have some districts, some very small areas where the infant mortality rate is actually worse than it is in Syria. We have this, and yet those great Americans continue on. And I bring this up because you have everything in Pennsylvania, the rurals, the urbans. It's a wonderful microcosm of all of America. And so that's kind of why I think it'd be great to represent it, because I've been all over this state when I ran for Senate. And I think it's a good way to meet in one state almost all types of Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Very true. Now, during your 2016 Pennsylvania Senate run, you walked around 422 miles is what I saw. New Hampshire, during this presidential run, you walked over 100 miles. Why do you feel like walking across the state is the best way to campaign?
Well, when I was reading books with my wife to our young daughter as she was very young. One of them was To Kill a Mockingbird, where Atticus has said to Jem and to Scout, you can't know a man till you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. When I was a Navy admiral or captain of a ship, I would always go down, let's say as an admiral, when the last planes came home from doing their strikes at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, they'd land from Afghanistan or Iraq. When the troops were home, I would then stay up until they were, and then I'd go down the mess decks where the enlisted men and women were. Because it's like 5,000 sailors, like a hotel, people up eating all the time, going on watch. And I'd sit there with them and just chat with them as I ate. I think being out there with people really matters. And too many don't go out there to get to so that people know what they're going through. The politicians know what they're going through. And then when they get to Washington, they get in another cocoon. I see it all the time when I was down there. There's some politicians, even in Pennsylvania, that when someone writes a letter to them, they don't even answer it because they're in a safe seat. And that's why I brought up the beauty of Pennsylvania. It's a purple state. And so that's why I walk, is to let people know that I want to understand what their concerns are. And second, boy, I got to tell you, you learn a lot during those walks. I certainly did.
That's great. So New Hampshire and Pennsylvania are the two very politically, politically diverse states. Like you said, purple states. What are some of like the best stories or like individual encounters you had when talking with Pennsylvanians and people from New Hampshire?
You mean over there in those two states?
Yeah.
Yeah, I tell you, Iowa nice, they call it. I tell you, it's true. They are extraordinarily nice people. You talk about civility, you see it there. Even I went to 15 parades, and I shake everybody's hand in a parade. My supporters pass my brochure ahead of me, and I run back and forth, and I say, hey, that's me on that brochure. How about taking it home tonight and reading it? 1 out of 4 will have been looked at it just before I get there to say, thank you for your service. But I'll tell you, they love their parades. As I called one woman, and I said, how many is going to be on the parade route so we bring enough brochures? She said, well, there'll probably be more than usual. We haven't had a parade for 4 weeks. They love their parades. They love this community coming together. On the other hand, in New Hampshire, it's probably the only state you're going to find a stadium, a drag race stadium built for snowmobiles. And it's just tremendous. As I walked across that state, though, I met people that were my profiles of courage that I was so taken with. A young man that has this, what he calls the Caterpillar Lab. But I have to tell you, walk in, it's like an Apple store. Computers all over the place that he takes around this nation to museums of science. And when you listen to him in his enthusiasm, in his young 20s, explain in a little acorn where under the microscope, showing up on a computer slide, you can see inside the larva of a caterpillar and a parasite in it. And by the time he's explaining it, and I look outside the window at the forest that was across the street, I'll never, ever not better understand the ecological system of the earth because of that little wonderful explanation he gave me. I started a trek actually in a mental health facility. Sunday morning at 8:30, they came in, the people who run it, and I sat there as they talked about the opioids that they dealt with, challenges. They talked about first responders. Hundreds of first responders are there with the trauma that they've gone through that is a mental challenge. And you find that these men and women willing to come in on their off day to talk to me about the importance of mental health, the biggest disease in America. It's pretty awesome. But that's what I kind of went through. And if I could, one more, a prison. I'll tell you, gentleman there had been running 27 years. And he said to me, I learned that you cannot control, as we're trained to control in our corrections training, human behavior. You can incentivize it, disincentivize it, but you can't control it. And every prisoner there is addressed as sir or ma'am. And if you come in and you're unshackled after court, maybe sentenced to 20 years, they sit down, they unshackle you if you're behaving. It's like a doctor's office. And they go up and they sign themselves in on a little computer, and they're treated just as though they're a gentleman or a gentlelady. But if you come in and you're misbehaving, they put you in a little slammer to the side. And it's the beginning of saying, we're going to incentivize your proper behavior. We're not going to try to control it, but we'll disincentivize it if you don't. It's a wonderful way of getting someone in a prison that then, treated with respect, has a better chance when they re-enter society afterwards.
Yeah. So during the second Democratic debate, you kept up with the candidates on stage and held your own miniature debate on Facebook at a Dunkin' Donuts. Like, what was your inspiration for doing this, and how did you think it impacted your campaign?
Well, first of all, I really love Dunkin' Donuts coffee. So, I mean, I'm sure Starbucks is fine, but I'll tell you, it's also less expensive and delicious. I love it. So that's why we did it there. Second is, I'm not on the debate stage. I got in a little late, and I even have a memo from one of the 3 cable news networks that said, Joe Sestak, former congressman and admiral, is in late. We're not going to have him on. Wow. So that was a hurdle I had to come over. Couldn't complain about it. I mean, I landed on the beach off my landing craft. I can't complain about the condition of the beach. The artillery's coming in. I just got to go plow ahead. But because of that, what we decided is I'll just have somebody read me the questions that being said at the debate, and I'll go live stream it out there. Because I wanted to demonstrate that, yes, we really do have a different way to look at a number of these issues. Whether student loans of a wiser way we can approach it, or whether training for a lifetime, where my party is supposed to be standing for the blue-collar worker, and yet we spend less than any developed nation on labor force training. 65% of Americans who work don't have a college degree. And yet, when they get out of a coal mine, which I met a man when I walked across Pennsylvania that had done that, we don't have a real training for a lifetime to say, well, we're going to train you in green energy manufacturing. That's what we do in the military. We don't kick you out when your plane goes away that you maintain. We send you to the Air Force Community College and learn the new one. Why aren't we doing that? And so I just wanted to make sure this debate that I was showing that there was a better maybe way to look at how to approach the needs and the wants of all Americans.
Yeah, and I don't think we would be student media if we wouldn't ask you this question. You talked about it a little bit there about student loan debt. Like, how would you as president deal with the issue that cripples so many Americans?
There's a number of ways. First off, there's this wonderful program in government today called the REPAY program, REPAYE. We should make it mandatory, universal for all students, and grandfather for anybody who still has debt, where it's mandated you don't have to pay back more than 10% of your disposable income. And that's after you subtract from your disposable income 150% of the equivalent of the income of poverty level. So you're down about 7%. I think we should lower that to 5%. And after 20 years, the lower income especially, just be forgiven. That to me is a much saner way, so that if you don't have a job for a year, you don't pay anything back. You wait, and it's just a practical way of doing it. Number two, what we should be doing is recognizing that our government is making $127 billion this decade off the backs of students, because the interest rate that they charge on student loans is actually based on the 10-year Treasury bond. And the Congressional Research Office, Budget Office, has said, we're going to make $127 billion because we're charging the students too high a loan. We got to change that to where we don't make profit off the students. And third, students, 40% of them change colleges during their years in a college. And yet 50% of the courses are never accepted by another college because it's a business. And if I could add one more, we should do what we did for Title IX for women in sports decades ago, where we told public schools, hey, you want our public money? You got to make sure equal sports for women is for men. And as a result of that, the Atlantic Olympics, the women dominated. What we need to do is to say to colleges, your inflation rate for tuition is 3 or 4 times higher than normal inflation. Tell you what, you want some of our Pell Grants? You want some of our Stafford loans? You got to keep the tuition rate at normal inflation. And so there's a supply and demand issue here, but that's how I would resolve this issue, because you got to keep in mind only 2% of students who entered college since 2003 have a debt larger than $50,000. And so we got to make sure we do this in a practical way.
So I am a proud graduate from a STEM high school, a charter school of Wilmington, and I know that you advocate heavily for STEM education. Why do you advocate so heavily for STEM education, and would you like to see the spread of STEM schools across the country?
I would, but also across the world. I actually put together the first International Robotic Olympics after I left Congress. I brought together one high school age team from 158 nations into a Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. I got an Iranian team in here. I had everybody on Mr. Trump's travel ban list come in, a Syrian refugee team. I led by an all-girls Muslim team. 60% of them had never had any STEM education or even seen a robot before. I took 800 youth in America and put a Peace Corps online. I called it the Global STEM Corps. So that if you were at Carnegie Mellon, I recruited you, if you were in the robotics classes there, to adopt over the internet the Congo or Niger or Zimbabwe, where I went to the poor schools there. And they didn't have STEM, to where these youth of America then online taught them, after I shipped the robot out to them, how to put it together so it can compete well here. So this is a worldwide thing. But here's why I believe it. Technology is now the dominant player, whether it's economics or whether it's warfare. 5G network will revolutionize both of them. And if we don't have youth that have the ability to both use and also explore and create within technology, you will fall behind. And that's why I wanted to do this for the world. Because if Africa doesn't get it in the next generation everywhere, they may never catch up, for example. Last, I got to add this, though. I believe we should call it STEAM instead of STEM. That A of art needs to be in there. My daughter's going to be a creative writer. I don't dismiss that part of it, because who's going to create the concept of how the best to use technology? So do I think STEM is important? Bet I do, but it's got to be within STEAM, because at the end of the day, as John F. Kennedy once said, I look forward to an America that is renowned in the arts as it is in statecraft and business. So we need to start calling it STEAM.
I like that. I like STEAM.
Yeah, STEAM's a good word. You know, you talk a little bit about your military service, and you've been in the you had over 31 years of military experience. What were the most important lessons you've learned in being in the military?
I learned integrity's values, service to country, to others, above self, and accountability in answering for oneself. That's what I learned. And I bring that up, if I could, by a story. When I arrived off Afghanistan, after coming out, I headed the Navy's Treating Anti-Terrorism Unit. So for a brief period, I was on the ground, came out, took command of this aircraft carrier. There's 5,000 sailors on that aircraft carrier. Their average age is 19 and a half. I lived, I worked, and I went to war with the youth of America. And they're mighty fine. But that first night, I launched 8 pilots. 7 were guys that had been in the first Gulf War. They were pros from Dover. They'd been there, they'd done it. I wanted that strike to go down perfectly. But I funneled in what we call a nugget. Someone who'd not been off a carrier deck over a foreign country before. She was 26 years old. She was the one who disobeyed orders that night that had been passed down from me from on high, that nobody goes below 20,000 feet without permission. So I had time to move an electronic aircraft over to see if Stinger missiles that we had given the Mujahideen, who were now called the Taliban, but when they were the Mujahideen and fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, we gave them Stinger missiles, but that went to only 18,000 feet. But 8 special forces had been ambushed that night. And 4 guys called up, and they said, 4 are dead. We have moments left. Don't drop any lasers. They're too close. Somebody just strafe quickly, and we'll get out of here. The guys asked permission, as per direction. That young woman, that brand new pilot, we didn't have any women on ships, never mind flying the most advanced fighter aircraft of the United States Navy. When I joined up there in Vietnam, she felt she couldn't wait. Those men needed her now. She dove 3 times from 20,000 feet to 3,000 feet at 0200 in the morning, in the dark of the night, pulled up at 3,000 feet. And during that confusion she caused down there, the havoc of Gatling guns running down there, those 4 men picked up their dead and came home. And as I told Sean Hannity when I went on a show and he asked me about women in combat, is this political correctness? I said, Sean, they didn't care who saved their butt that night. But if she hadn't been given her equal opportunity to be all she could be, the common mission of the United States Navy wouldn't have succeeded. The lesson is that, but the lesson is also back to accountability. There was this woman who knew that ultimately her accountability was to those soldiers down there, above herself, above anything, even her career for disobeying orders. That is accountability. And that's what this country's looking for in its next president. Someone who's accountable to them, regardless of the consequences to oneself. So we trust again, and we come together again as a united America. That woman, when she came back and landed on that craft, every eye was looking down at somebody who was willing to be accountable for what, even when it had consequences for her.
So sticking on your military service, you were present at the Pentagon the day of the September 11th attacks. What was the experience like, and how has it motivated your foreign and military policy?
Yes, I had walked out of the Pentagon when shortly after, because I had to go to a meeting, the plane struck in. I came right back and spent that night on a makeshift command center up on the hill, looking down at that burning scar that I tell people had seared not just the Pentagon, but our nation. Soon, I was told I was going to Afghanistan, brief period, headed Navy Strategic Anti-Terrorism Unit, but I learned that America, we had always wanted away games. Our war's over there, but now, for the first time, we realize we might be having home games. Our war's here. So first off, I think the big lesson was we have to keep America safe. And that meant even more vigilance of working with friends and allies about this new threat of terrorism, because they know, they live over there where much of the evil begins to grow. Not because people want to be evil, but because sometimes poverty is what can drive someone to be attracted to something. Second, what I learned is when I came out of Afghanistan that first time, as I said to somebody, military stop problems, they never fix it. We would do more to fix the global war terror if we fixed the illiteracy rate of women in Afghanistan, which was 98% when I was on the ground there. Then our military now, after 19 years of war, is courageously still trying to stop it. So those were the kinds of principles I learned, as well as those who mistakenly took us into Iraq. They didn't learn the principle that before you use our military, you better know how it's going to end before you decide it's wise to begin. This invasion of Syria, as we abandoned into Syria, but the invasion into Syria by the Turk forces, after we abandoned our Kurdish allies, was just another domino effect from that decision so long ago of Democrats and Republicans who didn't understand. You better know how the world so that you knew how it would end before you began, and they did not. Those were the types of lessons I took, both immediately and then over the years of being out there for those conflicts and working in the White House with President Clinton earlier as his director for defense policy.
Great. Thanks for answering our question. That was probably a big moment in your life. Transitioning to domestic policy, you are proud to have received an F rating from the NRA and are a huge proponent of dismantling the gun show loophole. What legislation do you think is most effective in dismantling the gun show loophole, which is a pretty complicated issue?
What is most effective?
The gun show loophole. What
Yes. But you mean which means to do that?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Great question. And let me first say, I don't know if I'm proud. I just want people to understand that, the NRA did give me an F. But yet my Republican district, nearly 2-1, reelected me by 20 points without putting a penny into it. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that I respect the Heller decision that said by the Supreme Court you have a Second Amendment right to a gun, but it also said there are limits to that, and we have to come up with a way of agreeing what those limits are. So in Pennsylvania, hunting, or if you feel you need a pistol for security, I used to, even as a Navy captain, say, bring your personal weapons aboard. And on Sunday afternoon, I'd let them take it out of the armory. I'd tow a sled we made out of wood behind the ship, and I put a deer silhouette there so they could just enjoy themselves of what they would have done at home. But I want to make sure we close things like the gun show loophole. And how will I do that? What's the means? I have about 7 things I want to do my first day, and one of them is to go to a gun show. Actually, I went to a gun show as I walked across the granite state of New Hampshire. And I'm going to go there, and I'm going to ask Ollie North, who used to be president of the NRA, who happened to run my backside when I was deciding whether to go Marine Corps. And I thought back in the 70s that he was one of the finest leaders I'd met. But I kept some contact with him over the years, particularly when I went on Fox. And I'm going to ask him to go with me. And I'm going to say, I respect those who want to have the right to a gun. But I'm out here also to say, we got to talk that we need an assault weapons ban. I got to talk with you that police officers' death by assault weapons went to near 0 when we used to have one. We're going to have gun show loopholes got to be closed, because with background checks also, because we do not want those who shouldn't have guns to get them. Is it going to be tough? Yes. But I'm not going to do it from the ivory tower of, let's say, the White House. I'm going to be out there amongst them, sitting and talking with them of why I don't want to take all your guns at all. What I want is to make sure that my daughter and others no longer have to feel as though lockdowns are a natural part of being in a school. And so that's how I'm going to do it with them, not dividing us as I do it.
Yeah, you mentioned there the importance of assault rifles. Are you in favor of government buybacks of assault rifles?
I am, but I believe it should be voluntary. The law was one where it said you had a right to purchase it. And I think now to mandate that you're going to go in and take them out, is it ideal? No. But it is a way, I think, that when the right tone of background checks and things like that are done, and the other items we want, we will do a significant effort towards clamping down on those who might get access to guns to do the kind of rampages that have occurred. So to me, it should be a voluntary one.
Now, in your campaign announcement video, you have said that climate change is the greatest destructive threat to mankind. Climate change is a huge issue, especially for our young voter demographic. How do you plan on combating climate change?
I think first off, we have to show here at home the leadership, the commitment, and development of the technology that the rest of the world also needs from us, from leadership to technology. So I believe we need to do a carbon fee or carbon dividend, to where you put a fee on polluters and it rises each year. And that is passed on to consumers, but they get it paid back to them at a dividend at the end of the year. But in the meantime, they're incentivized to move to greener, more efficient types of vehicles, for example. Studies have shown that might take care of 90% of the emissions that are fueling climate change from transportation, and actually all fossil fuels. I believe we have to develop DAC technology. We have it, actually, we can do it today, where we pull CO2 out of the air, it comes out as a liquid, and we can bury it underground. But it's so expensive to do, trillions of dollars, that we need to make sure that we also do it in a cost-efficient way. Second, and most important, I think, is we have to recognize, among the other things we're going to do here at home, that it's the world where 85% of the damage comes from on climate change. And 194 of the 196 nations are not meeting their climate change commitments. That's where we need to restore U.S. leadership by a president who understands the world, because he has a breadth and depth of the world and convenes them to say you must meet your national commitments. Just take the tropics. 8% of the tropics today has air conditioning. 50% of it will have air conditioning in 2050. If they just get the typical Sears air conditioner instead of the most efficient one, that'll be equivalent to deforesting 2/3 of the Amazon. So we have to keep in mind that climate change danger will come upon us if we do nothing to convene the world to meet their commitment. It won't matter what we do by ourselves. It's all of us together or nothing.
So the topic of universal basic income was discussed a lot in the most recent Democratic debate. Are you at all surprised by the impact that this policy position has had in this election cycle?
Well, not really, because it sounds great, but nobody ever talks about the true implementation and the cost of it and the provenness that it could really work better than what I would propose. So, for example, I mentioned to you that we spend less than any developed nation on labor force training. I mean, we'll give a loan for someone to go to college. We'll give a loan to someone to get their master's degree. We'll give a loan to somebody to get their PhD. But what about the 65% of the labor force that uses their mind and their hands and they're kicked out of a job? We spend 0.001% of GDP to retrain them. If we set up, like I've proposed, a training for a lifetime to where you're trained and you're retrained and retrained as technology changes, because technology may become obsolete, but a worker should never become obsolete, particularly since we invested in them. All of a sudden you have those 12 million Americans who are outside the workforce today and can't get a job because they are not capable of having enough money to go to community college to get a new skill. When 40% of Americans don't even have $400 for an emergency, how are they going to get retrained? So if you fix that problem, all of a sudden you have workers that are willing to come back in the workforce. New Hampshire, their unemployment rate, they say, is 2.4%. No, it's 7.2% if you include those in New Hampshire who can't get a job because they don't have the skills or the monies to get a skill. So let's fix that problem first. Second, small businesses. We only create half as many small businesses today as we did back in 30 years ago. Small business creates 70% of all jobs, but we're only creating half as many. Why? They can't get startup money any longer. And the regulation burden in the last decade is 40% heavier on them than corporations. If we fix those two, and you're creating twice as many small businesses, and you have the trained workforce now ready to take those jobs that 1/3 of small businesses said they can't get, all of a sudden you have much more jobs, much more labor force trained, but the demand on them is going to be so much because there's more jobs that wages rise because now there's businesses demanding more workers, and all of a sudden you've actually increased the wages, which haven't increased the median level for 20 years. To me, that's the wiser way to create a rising wage rather than just having some set level down here.
So wrapping up here, Admiral Sestak, if you were to say one thing to the students here at Elizabethtown and just all of our viewers in general, what's the one message you'd like to get across to our viewership?
Recognize that the value you have as youth is you're not burdened with experience. You're not part of that establishment that soon people who graduate move into unconsciously or consciously. We talked about the Democratic Party just before we began down in Congress. My gosh, we're led in that Democratic Party and our senior positions down there, not by the youth, not even by people in the 30s or 40s. And so after people have been in an establishment a while, they began to take on a certain way of looking at things, and they're less willing to look at it different ways. For example, when I walked across Pennsylvania, my party didn't want me to do that. And so they actually ended up putting more money in against my race, against me, because I would not stop walking, because they just wanted me to fundraise. So I would just say to the youth, understand that when you graduate, it was so easy to go into the established way of doing things, but your value is you have been trained not what to think, but how to think. And I would say not being burdened with experience that teaches you a certain way of doing it is your most valuable asset. Use it wisely to see how you want to be creative in the world.
Now, my grandfather and dad are going to kick me if I don't ask you this. My grandfather served in the Navy, big Navy football fan. So how are you feeling about the Navy-Army football game this year?
Navy's got it. It always
Navy's
does.
got it.
Sometimes something happens that we don't, but that's a fluke. Go Navy, beat Army.
There you go. That's what I like to hear. All right. Well, thank you so much, Admiral Sestak. Big pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for joining us today. And best of luck in your 2020 campaign.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Mark. And those wonderful women that really ran this show behind the scenes there, thank you also. You couldn't do it without that, all that technical bringing it together. Thanks, everybody.
Definitely.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Admiral. That's all for us from Nude News today. We'll see you guys next week.